How I became an existential therapist. It started with my early decisions about religion, really, and I can trace the moment where I decided to commit myself to the search for truth. I was 7 years old, and I just kind of realized that other children in my class in school were generally baptized and were quite defined by belonging to a particular creed or a church. And in the Netherlands in the 50s, this meant that they were Protestants, Calvinists, Lutheran or Reformed, or even Catholic or Jewish. A couple of Hindus as well from the Indonesian background. And there seemed to be so many options on offer that it was a bit dismaying that I had been left out of this distribution of riches. It seemed to me, though, that there was a slight advantage in that I was exempt from having to go to places of worship on the weekend and was left free to do what I wanted to do. Most of my friends and cousins seemed to find going to church fairly tedious, and I couldn't quite grasp why on the one hand they thought it made them superior to me, and on the other hand they disliked what it meant. I was aware, though, that not having a religion was a social handicap in the 50s. It created a kind of aura of suspicion around me, and I was not one of the chosen as others seemed to think they were. And a few times parents warned friends that they shouldn't play with me because I was going to not be part of salvation and I would not go to heaven after my death. It troubled me deeply, of course, although I really did not believe them. And this made me very keen to set myself on a road towards figuring out what the truth about it all was. My parents were free thinkers, and that's how I got into this predicament in the first place. They had abandoned their early Christian beliefs after their experiences in the Second World War. And they had really started questioning everything they had learned from that experience. So they had joined the Theosophical Society, which was an organization that studied the great world religions and that tried to practice a kind of spirituality in a pluralistic way. They believed in reincarnation, for instance. In practice, it meant that I was exposed to different creeds. I knew about Hinduism and Buddhism and about Judeo-Christianity, but probably not much about Muslim concepts till later on. But at any rate, I remember my primary school teacher asking the whole class what our religions were, and I knew that I couldn't respond to that like other people did with such confidence and certainty. So I went home and checked with my parents what the truth about it was, what I should have said. And my father laughed and said I should have said that I'm a heathen. My mother didn't agree and was scandalized by this and said that I could probably say that I was either an atheist or an agnostic. And they explained the terms to me, and then I didn't agree because I really did not want to define myself by what I was not, a non-believer or a doubter. Because I had actually very deep and secret beliefs of my own by this time and had committed myself to nature and to the universe and wanted to make myself strong and good and true and be part of things and contribute to the world. I loved nature and I loved freedom and I loved fairness and kindness. I loved the sunshine on the North Sea waves and I loved the wind sweeping along the dunes, especially when I was on my bike, helping me along or challenging me. Both were good. I mostly loved to go camping with my parents, which we did 4 weeks every year. going all around Europe, discovering different countries, different languages, different ways in which people were living. And I realized that there were just so many different sorts of existence to choose from. I loved watching the clouds drift through the sky and thinking about those things, and I was mesmerized by thunderstorms and sunsets and started painting those things. When we used to sit by our tents at night, I used to watch the stars and planets and feel this incredibly deep sense of awe and an incredible sense of uplift and wanting to reach out for the stars and the skies. I really wanted to find out more about the world and the universe, and I wanted to understand it all and learn more and more and more and more. All of this was in sharp contrast to our actual living circumstances, which were in a tiny little flat on the second floor of a block of flats in the North Sea dunes at the south of The Hague. We looked out towards the sea, though, which was very good. But on all the other sides, we were looking out over new built flats and also construction sites, in which we used to play as well. My elder sister and I shared a tiny little box room, which was so small that one of our beds had to be pushed under the other one during the daytime, because otherwise you couldn't have walked into the room. So this created a lot of tension and a lot of conflict. And in that conflict, I always drew the short straw, really, because my sister was very feisty and very strong-minded. So I had to find ways to counteract this, and one of the ways was to read a lot and to go into my mind and to discover that there were worlds you could escape to away from social interaction. But of course, the other big influence over us both was that my parents had been quite traumatized by the World War, because the Netherlands had been very hard hit in the Second World War. The Hague in particular had been occupied by the Germans for 5 years and had been bombed a lot, and so lots of suffering had happened, especially in the final year of the war, during the winter of 44-45, where the Nazis cut off the west of the Netherlands and people went through what is now called the Dutch famine, where they simply didn't have any resources and lived on diets of 700 calories maximum. In addition to that, my father had had to hide in a freezing loft regularly when the razzias took place, where the Germans would pick up men that had avoided letting themselves be deported to work in Germany in the weapons industry. And my father so was hidden and lived in fear and caught double pneumonia, which very nearly killed him on several occasions, and left him with severe asthma, which I heard him suffer from a lot of the time. My mother also, as an apprentice nurse, had been nursing sick children suffering from starvation and diphtheria and various other illnesses that were rife during the war, like tetanus and tuberculosis. Our maternal grandparents had lost their home twice over, once in a bombing in The Hague and the second time at the end of the war when they lived in Arnhem, when that was attacked by the Allies. So there was a lot of suffering, and many of my uncles had been in Germany deported and had suffered from that. And uncles of my mother had been shot dead, and cousins, for opposing the Germans. They were summarily executed in the street. So these were very severe circumstances, and I saw around me also in the neighbors a lot of suffering of that kind There was one neighbor who had been in the Japanese war camp and who had regular nightmares, and we could hear him screaming at night. We had a neighbor who had one arm because she lost an arm in one of the bombings. We knew people with the tattoos on their forearms having come out of concentration camps. It was a very grim atmosphere in which, at the same time, there was this optimism of the 50s of making people rise again and creating a better world. But I remember vividly that my mother had to buy food on coupons and that there was still very little food indeed. And also very little other resources. We had a tiny little kitchen. My mother hand washed until finally she got a washing machine. I remember her standing over that tub every Monday. And I remember how normal that was and how amazed we were when circumstances became easier in the 60s. Clearly, reality was a very scary thing, and I needed some positive beliefs in order to cope with that. So I was always searching for a theory or an idea that would help me find strength in a threatening world. So, without the luxury of a religion or a god, I was delighted when I discovered philosophy. In the beginning, I think I just discovered philosophy by reading lots of books. And because my father had spent some time in Paris when I was a tiny little girl, French literature was particularly interesting to me. I read Camus and Sartre and Anouilh and de Beauvoir quite early on and found them intoxicating and also a little bit terrifying at times. I also felt very supported by the kind of philosophy that I discovered when I started my classical studies when I was 12 years old. In those classical studies, I learned to read Plato in Greek and became very, very enamored of Socrates in particular. Socrates was a very special person, I thought, who was searching for truth as I was, but in a much more effective way. He had a method for this. His dialectical method and his meiotic method really worked. And he also had this courage, this amazing certainty that following truth rather than social convention was the right thing to do. And that became my role model, really, and I've tried to live in that way ever since. So studying the classics gave me a lot, and it wasn't just Socrates either, because in Latin we also read Seneca and Cicero and Marcus Aurelius, and all of those philosophies, the Stoics in particular, as well as Socratic and Platonic philosophy, really came to life for me and became very much integrated into my way of living. So when I left the Netherlands at 18 to go to France and to study and live in Montpellier and discover loads more authors than I had already read, my horizons really expanded a lot. And this became more so as I learned about phenomenology from a very good teacher called Michel Henry, who was an excellent French phenomenologist who has written many books and who helped me to accept that doing phenomenology and following an existential theoretical model could be applied to working with people in psychotherapy. So through my philosophy studies, I became interested in psychotherapy, particularly because by then I was living with a medical student who was specializing in psychiatry, and I started going with him to his work in psychiatry. Initially, I went with him to a ward with autistic children, and after that to a ward where he was working with young women, especially anorexic young women. And in both these wards, I was shocked by how little care people were given and how a person's dignity and a person's reality were taken away as soon as they were hospitalized in a mental institution. So he and I decided that we should find places where this wasn't the case and where people were much more into freeing people's minds and helping them understand where they had gotten stuck or why things had become difficult, rather than treating them as mental patients. And the first way in which we did this was to go around to various organizations in Italy and all over France, later also in California and in the Netherlands too, to find out what was on offer. And then in 1973, we moved in to live and work residentially in the psychiatric hospital of Saint-Alban in the Massif Central in the Lozère, which had been the first hospital that had taken down the walls of the around the hospital, and where community psychiatry and social psychiatry and ergotherapy were practiced. And I learned an enormous amount working with those people and talking with those people and beginning to apply my own philosophical ideas to that work. I also decided it was time to go back to university, and when we moved to another psychiatric hospital in Agen, I went back to Bordeaux University to become a clinical psychologist and also continue to study psychotherapy. Initially from a Lacanian perspective, but of course reading Freud and Jung and Lacan and Irigaray and lots of other people, Deleuze, Guattari, none of this satisfied my real wish to combine my philosophical background and my belief system with psychological methods. And I began working more and more on finding a way to combine those two. By this time, I had started reading R.D. Laing's work and found it very compatible with my search and with what we had been trying to do in Saint-Alban ourselves. And so we met some of the people from the anti-psychiatric movement in London at a conference in Milan, and went over to London to check out what they were doing and liked initially what we were seeing, and were then invited to come over to London, which we did in 1977, starting again, living in one of the Arbor therapeutic communities and living closely with people who had refused to be taken over by the psychiatric world, who had no longer wanted to be in psychiatric institutions and who wanted to get through their troubles, their deep troubles, without even relying on medication. Of course, this was extremely challenging and also extremely interesting and changed my life completely. I decided to stay in London and to really devote myself to finding better ways to do this job, more effective ways of working with people, because the psychoanalytic methods that were still being used in those communities I thought were quite old-fashioned, and that with a more philosophical approach we could do much better. Having been to California for some months and being exposed to humanistic methods as well, made it easier for me to start working with an MA in existential psychotherapy at Antioch University in London and start teaching existential psychology there. Out of that, I then created a course in existential psychotherapy, which became validated, which I moved to a different college, Regent's College, where I was able then to develop a whole school around those ideas. In 1996, I left Regent's College and I created an entirely new school, the New School of Psychotherapy and Counseling, which specializes in existential training and existential psychotherapy. And of course, my own life has been full of challenges where I've had to show that my ideas could be put into practice. I have also continued to work with people for over 40 years now. And I never cease to be amazed at people's ability and capacity and intelligence for tackling terrific problems in their lives and long-standing chronic suffering. Once they get a little bit of help to get new perspective and to see new horizons for their own lives, and they understand the difficulties of living better, they can so easily improve, and they find courage and dedication to that kind of change that is astounding at times, and that leads to fantastic progress. Of course, it never gets easier because life always throws difficulties at us, but nevertheless, people find new strength in themselves, and they also find that when they do that, when they rise to their challenges, life meets them more than halfway and good things start to happen when previously it seemed that everything would just go wrong over and over again. So I find that the writings of existential philosophers East and West and over many, many centuries can be extremely helpful in giving us clearer ideas for the kinds of ways in which we can learn to live that are not based either in superstition or fanaticism, but that are based in self-reflection and understanding and learning about life as we live it. So I think doing that is well worth it. Well, it never gets any easier. It makes it much more satisfactory and worthwhile to know that although we are in a world where there is conflict, anxiety, aggression, loss and sadness, we can also find ways to create new things that are good, understand ideas that help us find a bit more truth and to find good principles to live by, like loving ourselves and loving each other.